Looking back, I can see how the pieces of the puzzle were always there, scattered around me, just waiting for me to put them together. It's strange how hindsight can make the signs so glaringly obvious, yet at the time, I saw nothing but the comfortable life we'd built together. I was content, maybe even complacent, and that might have been my first mistake. I'm Jonathan, 37 years old, and I own a small but successful landscaping business. It's a hands-on job, physically demanding and rewarding in equal measure. I've always prided myself on providing a stable, predictable life for my wife, Evelyn. She's 34 and works as a corporate consultant, a high-pressure role that often demands late nights, travel, and networking. We've been married for 8 years. On the surface, everything seemed fine. We had a nice home, supportive friends, and enough shared laughter to get us through the occasional rough patch. Sure, Evelyn's job kept her busy, but I understood the demands of her career. She was ambitious, and I respected that about her. But there were moments, fleeting as they were, that hinted at something deeper, a disconnect I couldn't quite put my finger on. Evelyn's career had always been a point of pride for her, but over the past year, it felt like it had started to consume her. Late-night meetings, weekend travel, and endless, client dinners, became the norm. At first, I didn't think much of it. Corporate consulting was competitive, and Evelyn had always been meticulous about maintaining her professional image. She'd come home late, kick off her heels, and tell me about how exhausting the evening had been. I'd listen, offer her a glass of wine, and let her vent. But as the months went on, the dinners became more frequent. She'd spend extra time getting ready, choosing outfits with more care than usual, applying her makeup with precision. I remember joking once, "You're going to make your coworkers jealous, looking like that." She laughed it off, but there was something in her smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't just the frequency of the dinners that started to bother me. It was the way she talked about them, or didn't. When I'd ask who she was meeting, her answers were vague, "Oh, just a few clients," or "the usual group from the office." If I pressed for details, she'd brush me off, saying she was too tired to talk about work. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that the woman I'd built a life with wouldn't lie to me. But as the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, as I lay in bed waiting for her to come home, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Why was she so secretive about these dinners? Why did she seem more excited about them than she did about spending time with me? And why did I feel like I was slowly losing the woman I thought I knew? That was the moment I realized our marriage wasn't as stable as I'd convinced myself it was. There were cracks in the foundation, and I was about to find out just how deep they went. The shift in Evelyn's behavior was subtle at first, small things I could almost explain away if I tried hard enough. She'd always been diligent about her appearance, but lately, she seemed to take extra care whenever she had one of her work dinners. Her outfits became more stylish, her makeup bolder, and she started wearing perfume I hadn't smelled on her in years. "Just keeping up appearances," she'd say if I commented on it. "You know how competitive my field is." It seemed reasonable at the time. Networking was part of her job, and first impressions mattered. Still, I couldn't help but notice how much effort she put into these evenings, especially compared to how relaxed she was when we went out together. The timing of her dinners started to feel too coincidental. She'd go out almost weekly, always on the same days. Wednesday evenings were her go-to, though Fridays popped up frequently as well. She claimed it was because clients preferred midweek meetups or to wind down after a hectic week. One Wednesday evening, I decided to wait up for her. Normally, I'd fall asleep on the couch watching TV, but something about that night gnawed at me. She'd left the house around 6:30, looking stunning in a navy blue dress I hadn't seen before. "Don't wait up," she said with a quick kiss on my cheek. "It'll be a late one." I watched the clock tick past midnight, my unease growing with every hour. She came home around 12:45, her face flushed and her hair slightly mussed. "How was the dinner?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She waved a hand dismissively, kicking off her heels. "Long, exhausting. I just want to shower and sleep." I didn't press her, but the way she avoided eye contact stuck with me. Then there were the stories, small inconsistencies that made my gut tighten. One night, she mentioned meeting a client named Mark, but a week later, she referred to him as Mike. Another time, she said the dinner was at an Italian restaurant downtown, but when I casually asked about the menu, she hesitated before saying she'd forgotten what she ordered. Evelyn never forgot details like that. The moment that truly set off alarm bells came a few weeks later. She was in the bathroom getting ready for another dinner, and her phone buzzed on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but the message preview caught my eye. "Looking forward to tonight. Can't wait to see you." The sender's name was Jay. I froze, staring at the screen. Evelyn had plenty of colleagues, but something about the message felt different. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd say to a coworker or even a client. When she came out of the bathroom, I casually asked, "Who's Jay?" Her eyes flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, just Jacob from work. He's in charge of the new account I'm helping with." Her explanation seemed plausible enough, but my instincts told me otherwise. The flicker of hesitation, the slightly defensive tone, it was all wrong. That night, as I lay in bed listening to her soft breathing, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Was I overthinking things? Was I being paranoid? Or was there something going on that Evelyn didn't want me to know? The doubts festered, growing stronger with each passing day. I started paying closer attention, watching for patterns, looking for clues, trying to piece together the truth. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had a sinking feeling I wouldn't like what I found. Once I began paying closer attention, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. Evelyn's work dinners weren't just frequent, they followed a pattern. Wednesday evenings were almost always booked, and certain Fridays seemed non-negotiable. Each time, she left the house dressed impeccably, her excitement barely masked by her attempts at nonchalance. I started keeping a mental log of her outings. Where she claimed she was going, who she said she was meeting, and how long she'd be gone. As the weeks went by, certain details didn't line up. One Wednesday, Evelyn mentioned she was meeting a client named Lisa at a steakhouse downtown. But when I casually asked about Lisa a week later, she seemed confused. "Oh, I haven't seen her in months," she said. "Why do you ask?" It was a small slip, but it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. I started noticing how much effort she put into getting ready for these dinners. New outfits appeared in her wardrobe, each more stylish than the last. When I asked about them, she'd wave it off. "Just something I picked up on sale," she'd say. "I need to look professional for these meetings." Professional was one thing, but some of her choices felt more suited for a date than a business dinner. Form-fitting dresses, high heels, jewelry I hadn't seen in years, it didn't add up. The tipping point came one Friday evening. Evelyn had mentioned meeting a client at a French bistro downtown. I hadn't been to the place in years, but I remembered it being small and intimate, not exactly the kind of setting for a work meeting. Before she left, I asked casually, "What's the occasion?" "That place is pretty upscale for a client dinner." She laughed lightly, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Oh, they're just picky about their food. You know how some clients are." I nodded, hiding my unease. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check our joint credit card statement to see if the bistro charge appeared. Sure enough, there it was, a $180 charge from the restaurant. But something else caught my eye, a second charge from a nearby cocktail bar on the same night. The time stamp on the cocktail bar charge was nearly 2 hours after the dinner. Evelyn hadn't mentioned going anywhere after the bistro. She'd come home around 11, claiming the dinner had run late. When I asked her about the evening, she'd said nothing about cocktails or staying out longer. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She was lying, if not about the dinners themselves, then about what was happening afterward. That weekend, I found myself replaying the past few months in my mind, trying to piece together the fragments of information I had. The vague answers, the inconsistencies, the messages from Jay. It all pointed to one thing: Evelyn wasn't being honest with me. But I didn't have proof. Not yet. I decided to take a more direct approach. The next time Evelyn had one of her dinners, I planned to see for myself where she was going and who she was meeting. If my suspicions were wrong, I'd know. But if I was right, well, I wasn't sure I was ready for that answer. For now, all I could do was wait. The following Wednesday arrived with an odd sense of foreboding. Evelyn had mentioned another dinner, this time at an upscale seafood place downtown. Just a client meeting, she said casually as she rummaged through her closet, pulling out a sleek black dress that I didn't recognize. "You've been having a lot of these client dinners lately," I said, keeping my tone light. She glanced at me, her expression neutral but guarded. "It's part of the job, Jonathan. Networking keeps me relevant in the industry. You know that." I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, but the seed of doubt was too firmly planted. That evening, I waited until she left before grabbing my car keys. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but the need for answers outweighed the guilt gnawing at the back of my mind. If Evelyn wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I parked a block away from the restaurant and waited, watching the entrance. My stomach churned as I spotted Evelyn stepping out of her car. She looked stunning, her hair perfectly styled, her heels clicking confidently on the pavement. But she wasn't alone. A man joined her, a tall, well-dressed guy with a neatly trimmed beard and an easy smile. They exchanged a brief greeting, his hand brushing her lower back as they walked into the restaurant together. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Who was he? Evelyn had never mentioned anyone like him, not in passing, not in her vague dinner explanations. I sat frozen in my car, torn between storming into the restaurant and staying hidden. After a few minutes, I decided to wait. 2 hours later, they emerged, laughing and talking like old friends. They didn't part ways as I hoped they might. Instead, they walked down the street together, stopping in front of a small cocktail lounge. I followed from a distance, my heart pounding with every step. Inside, the lounge was dimly lit and intimate, filled with couples sitting close and sharing quiet conversations. Evelyn and the man took a corner booth, their heads bent together as they talked. From where I stood, it was clear this wasn't a business meeting. Their body language was too familiar, their smiles too personal. When he reached across the table and took her hand, my worst fears were confirmed. I left the lounge before I did something rash, my mind spinning with questions and emotions I couldn't control. When Evelyn returned home later that night, I was sitting in the living room, waiting. She seemed surprised to see me still awake, but quickly masked it with a smile. "You're up late," she said, kicking off her heels. "How was dinner?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She hesitated for the briefest moment before replying, "Good. Productive. The client seems happy with the progress we're making." I nodded, letting her lie to me one more time. I didn't confront her that night, I needed time to process what I'd seen and figure out my next move. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just about work. Evelyn was hiding something, and now I had the proof to uncover the full truth. The following days were a haze of quiet observation and internal turmoil. Evelyn carried on as though nothing had changed, completely unaware that I'd followed her to the restaurant and the cocktail lounge. She still left for work dinners, still came home late with the same tired excuses, and still looked me in the eye with a smile that felt increasingly hollow. But now, I couldn't unsee the truth. The man I'd seen with her haunted my thoughts, his easy smile, the way he touched her back, the way she held his hand in that intimate booth. There was no doubt in my mind that this wasn't just business. I needed more than a glimpse through a restaurant window, more than circumstantial evidence. If I was going to confront Evelyn, I needed irrefutable proof. I started by checking our shared credit card statement. It didn't take long to find charges that aligned with her supposed work dinners, high-end restaurants, cocktail bars, even a hotel bill that made my stomach churn. But it wasn't just the spending that caught my attention. The dates and times of the charges matched the nights she'd been out late. I cross-referenced them with her calendar, which she'd synced to her phone. There were gaps, periods she'd marked as client meetings, that seemed to correspond a little too neatly with the transactions. Next, I checked her phone while she was in the shower. I'd never done it before, but desperation has a way of eroding boundaries you once thought were unbreakable. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A text thread with someone saved as J confirmed everything. The messages were a mix of playful banter and outright flirtation. J, can't wait to see you tonight. That dress from last week is still on my mind. Evelyn, you'll just have to wait and see what I wear this time, winky face. Further back, there were messages referencing dinners and plans to meet at hotels. My hands shook as I scrolled, each message cutting deeper than the last. This wasn't just a passing fling or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a full-blown affair, one that she had carefully hidden from me while maintaining the facade of our marriage. The betrayal felt like a weight crushing my chest. I thought about the years we'd spent building our life together, the promises we'd made, the trust I'd so freely given her. How could she look me in the eye every day, knowing what she was doing behind my back? That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage and trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. Was it my fault? Had I been too distracted with work, too complacent in our relationship? Or was this entirely on her, a choice she made, knowing full well the damage it would cause? By morning, I had a plan. I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not until I had every piece of evidence I needed. But one thing was certain, Evelyn wasn't the person I thought she was, and our marriage would never be the same. The days leading up to the confrontation felt like a slow burn, each hour adding fuel to the fire of my anger and heartbreak. Evelyn continued her routine, oblivious to the fact that I knew about her lies. Every smile she gave me, every casual, "How was your day?" felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't pretend any longer. I had everything I needed, the credit card statements, the calendar gaps, the messages from J. The time for excuses and deception was over. It was a Friday evening when I decided to confront her. Evelyn had just come home from another work dinner, her face flushed, and her hair slightly out of place. She kicked off her heels by the door and looked at me with the same tired smile she always wore after one of these nights. "Hey, Jonathan," she said, walking past me toward the kitchen. "Dinner's done. Hope your day was okay." I followed her, my heart pounding. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm but steady. She turned, her expression cautious. "Okay, what about?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the dining table, where I'd laid out everything I'd uncovered, the receipts, the credit card statements, and screenshots of her text messages with J. Her eyes fell on the pile, and I saw the color drain from her face. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. She stepped closer, her hand hovering over the evidence as if touching it would somehow make it disappear. Jonathan, I can explain. No, I interrupted, my voice sharp. You don't get to explain. Not after months of lying to me, sneaking around, and pretending everything was fine. Who is Jay? How long has this been going on? Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. Jonathan, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. Don't, I snapped. Don't give me that, I didn't mean for it to happen, garbage. You meant it every time you texted him, every time you met him, every time you lied to me about where you were. Her tears started then, but I wasn't moved. It's not what you think, she said, her voice breaking. It was just. I felt so lost, so unappreciated. Jay was someone who listened, who made me feel. Spare me, I said coldly. Do you think I haven't been here, trying? Do you think I haven't noticed how distant you've been? You had a choice, Evelyn. You could have talked to me. Instead, you chose him. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking as she wiped at her tears. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. I'll end it, Jonathan. I swear. I'll cut him out of my life. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and pain. Fix this? I repeated bitterly. Do you honestly think we can come back from this? That I can just forget everything you've done? Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I felt the faintest pang of pity. But it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming weight of betrayal. I need time to think, I said finally, my voice devoid of emotion. But right now, I can't even look at you. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing at the table. As I shut the door to the guest room behind me, a single thought consumed me: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the confrontation were a blur of emotional exhaustion and silence. Evelyn and I became like strangers living under the same roof, navigating around each other as though any interaction might ignite another explosion. She tiptoed through the house, her presence quieter and more subdued than ever. I could tell she wanted to talk, to plead her case, but I wasn't ready. I spent most of my time in the guest room, avoiding her as much as possible. The bed felt foreign, the walls too bare, but it was better than sharing a space with her. Every time I saw her face, I was reminded of the betrayal, the lies, the deceit, the months she'd spent living a double life while I naively trusted her. Evelyn tried to show she was sorry in small ways. She cooked dinner every night, left notes on the counter apologizing, and even stopped going to her so-called work dinners entirely. But her efforts felt hollow, like putting a bandage on a wound that was far too deep to heal. One evening, as I sat in the guest room scrolling aimlessly through my phone, I heard a soft knock at the door. Jonathan? Her voice was tentative, almost fragile. I didn't answer, but she pushed the door open anyway. She stood there in the dim light, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Can we talk? She asked. I sighed, setting my phone down. What is there to talk about, Evelyn? She stepped into the room, wringing her hands nervously. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But I want to make this right. I want to fix us. I shook my head, my chest tightening. You don't just fix something like this. It's not that simple. Her voice cracked as she said, I love you, Jonathan. I never stopped loving you. What happened with Jay, it wasn't real. It didn't mean anything. I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean anything. You lied to me for months. You spent our money on dinners, hotels, and God knows what else. You chose him over me, over us, and now you want me to believe it didn't mean anything? She started crying again, her sobs quiet but steady. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm still committed to us. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what we'd lost. But another part of me, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, couldn't see a way forward. I need time, I said finally. Time to figure out what I want, what I can live with. She nodded, wiping at her tears. Take all the time you need, she whispered. Just, please don't give up on me. On us. She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. I sat there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. Could I ever trust her again? Could I forgive her, knowing what she'd done? Or was this the beginning of the end for us? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that the life we'd built together was hanging by a thread, and I wasn't sure if it was worth trying to save. Evelyn's promises to change seemed sincere in the days following our conversation. She stopped going out for dinners altogether, came home from work earlier than usual, and even began leaving her phone on the kitchen counter, as if to prove she had nothing to hide. But no matter how hard she tried, I couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in the back of my mind. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight, and every small gesture she made only reminded me of the lies she had told. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her laptop, I noticed her close the screen quickly when I entered the room. It was a subtle movement, but it was enough to make my suspicions flare. What's so important? I asked casually, nodding toward her laptop. She hesitated for a moment before replying, just work emails. Nothing interesting. Her tone was light, almost dismissive, but the way she avoided my gaze set off alarm bells. Later that night, while she was in the shower, I decided to check her laptop. She hadn't logged out of her email, and I quickly scanned the most recent messages. Most were mundane, work-related threads, but one subject line stood out, last night. My heart raced as I clicked on it. The message was from Jay. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. Jay, I can't stop thinking about last night. You always make it worth the risk. Let's meet soon. Beneath the email, Evelyn's response was just as damning. Evelyn, we need to be careful. I don't want him to suspect anything. Let me figure it out. I sat back in the chair, my hands trembling. She had promised me it was over, begged me to give her a second chance, and yet here she was, still lying, still sneaking around. The anger I'd managed to suppress for weeks came flooding back, stronger than ever. She hadn't just betrayed me once, she'd done it again, despite everything we'd been through. When Evelyn came out of the shower, I was waiting for her in the living room. She stopped in her tracks when she saw the laptop open on the coffee table, the incriminating email displayed on the screen. Her face went pale. Jonathan, I can explain. Don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't insult me with another excuse. You told me it was over. You begged me to trust you, to give you another chance. And this is what you do. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was going to end it, she stammered. I just didn't know how to. Enough. I shouted, slamming my hand down on the coffee table. You don't get to play the victim here. You made your choice, Evelyn. And this time, there's no coming back from it. She sank into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, but her tears meant nothing to me now. My heart was too hardened, too broken to feel anything but rage. I walked out of the room, leaving her to her tears. As I shut the door to the guest room, I knew one thing for certain, this was the end of our marriage. And there was no saving what she had so willingly destroyed. The day after the second betrayal, I called in sick to work, unable to face the world. I spent the morning sitting at the dining table, staring at nothing in particular, replaying everything in my mind. Evelyn tried to speak to me once, standing in the doorway with red-rimmed eyes, but I didn't even look at her. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she whispered before retreating back upstairs. Her apology felt meaningless, a hollow echo of the promises she'd broken. That evening, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay silent about what she'd done. If Evelyn wanted to ruin our marriage, then I would make sure she faced the consequences of her actions, publicly and painfully. I started by telling my closest friends. Over beers at a local bar, I laid everything out, the dinners, the texts, the lies. My friends listened in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of pity and anger. "Man, I don't know how you kept it together this long," my friend Marcus said, shaking his head. "She doesn't deserve you, John." I nodded, clenching my jaw. "She's not getting away with it." The next step was more calculated. I knew Evelyn's workplace thrived on appearances and professional respect. Her affair with Jay, who I now knew was a coworker, wouldn't sit well with her bosses or colleagues if they found out. I drafted an email, attaching screenshots of her texts with Jay, along with the timeline of her supposed work dinners. I sent it anonymously to her HR department, ensuring there was no way to trace it back to me. Within days, I started hearing about the fallout. Evelyn came home one evening looking pale and shaken. She avoided me entirely, retreating to her office without a word. Later, I overheard her on the phone, her voice tense and panicked. "It's not true," she said. "Someone's spreading lies." "No, I can't prove it, but I swear it's not what it looks like." I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. She'd built her career on professionalism and trust, and now it was crumbling beneath her feet. The whispers spread quickly. Our mutual friends started reaching out, their messages dripping with thinly veiled curiosity. "Hey, John," one text read. "I heard about Evelyn. Is everything okay?" I didn't bother sugarcoating it. "She cheated," I replied simply. "More than once. We're done." Word got back to Evelyn, of course. One night, she confronted me in the kitchen, her face a mix of anger and desperation. "You're ruining my life," she said, her voice shaking. I turned to face her, my expression cold. "No, Evelyn. You ruined your own life. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked like she might say something else. But instead, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Despite the satisfaction of watching her face the consequences, I couldn't ignore the emptiness that lingered in the aftermath. Revenge had given me a sense of control, but it hadn't healed the pain. If anything, it had only deepened the void. As the days turned into weeks, I realized the truth: there were no winners in this. Evelyn had destroyed our marriage, and I had destroyed what was left of her reputation. And now, we were both left standing in the wreckage, bitter and broken. The fallout hit Evelyn harder than even I expected. She started coming home earlier each day, her usual confidence replaced by a quiet, defeated demeanor. Her phone no longer buzzed with work calls or messages. The faint spark of energy she carried into the house after her work dinners was long gone, replaced by silence and occasional bouts of crying that she didn't even try to hide. I didn't ask how things were at her job. I didn't have to. From the snippets I overheard during her phone calls, it was clear her professional life was unraveling. "It's not true," she'd say, her voice breaking. "I swear, the dinners were legitimate." "No, I didn't. Look, I don't know who's saying these things, but it's not fair." Her words might have stirred some pity in me if I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes. If I hadn't felt the gut-wrenching pain of betrayal twice. Instead, I felt detached, watching her struggle from a distance as if I were an outsider in her life. The final blow came when she received a formal notice from her company. It arrived in the mail, a sleek envelope that Evelyn opened with trembling hands at the kitchen table. Her face crumpled as she read the letter, her lips moving silently over the words. Then she placed the paper down, her hands shaking, and looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "They're letting me go," she whispered. I didn't respond. They said the rumors have made it impossible for me to maintain client relationships." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. I had wanted her to face consequences for what she'd done, but watching her unravel completely wasn't the victory I'd imagined. It felt hollow, like winning a battle only to find the war had left you just as damaged. Evelyn stayed home after that. Her once-packed schedule was reduced to aimless hours of sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. Occasionally, she'd try to talk to me, her tone softer, almost pleading. "Jonathan, I know I hurt you," she said one night, her voice trembling. "But do you really hate me this much? To ruin everything I've worked for?" I set down the book I'd been pretending to read and looked at her. "You ruined it yourself, Evelyn. I just made sure the truth came out." She flinched as if I'd struck her, then stood and left the room without another word. The collapse of her career and reputation spilled over into every corner of our lives. Friends who used to call or visit disappeared. The few mutual friends we had left sided with me, offering their quiet support while keeping their distance from her. And yet, as much as I tried to tell myself I'd won, I couldn't escape the growing emptiness inside me. I'd torn down Evelyn's world, but in doing so, I'd destroyed any remnants of the life we once shared. One night, as I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all hit me. This wasn't just the end of our marriage, it was the end of everything we'd built together. And no amount of revenge could fill the void it left behind. The collapse was complete, and all that remained was rubble. Evelyn and I existed in the same house, but it was clear we were no longer partners, no longer even a semblance of a couple. She spent her days in silence, rarely leaving the house except for brief errands. I buried myself in work, taking on more hours and projects than ever before. The less time I spent at home, the better. One evening, I came home late to find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a half-empty glass of wine. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. She looked up as I walked in, but didn't say anything. It had been weeks since she'd tried to talk to me, and even longer since we'd had anything resembling a normal conversation. "Jonathan," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. I paused, unsure how to respond. "What?" "I've been thinking," she said, tracing her finger around the rim of the glass. "Maybe it's time for me to go." I set my bag down and leaned against the counter. "What do you mean?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I don't think I can fix this. I don't think there's anything left to fix. You don't trust me, and I don't blame you. But staying here, it's killing both of us." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her she was just running away from the mess she'd made. But another part of me, the part that had grown numb to the constant tension and resentment, knew she was right. "Where would you go?" I asked finally. She shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe to my sister's for a while. Maybe somewhere new. I need to start over." Her words felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness, just quiet acceptance. "When?" I asked. "Soon," she said. "I'll figure something out this week." The rest of the evening passed in silence. I couldn't bring myself to feel relief or sadness. I felt nothing. A few days later, she packed her things. There wasn't much fanfare, no emotional goodbyes or dramatic declarations. She left behind most of her belongings, taking only a few suitcases and a box of personal items. Before she walked out the door, she turned to me one last time. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. And then she was gone. The house felt even emptier after she left. At first, I thought the quiet would be a relief, but it only amplified the echoes of everything that had happened. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. I tried to distract myself with work, with friends, with anything that would keep my mind from drifting back to her. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the lingering question, had revenge really been worth it? I had wanted to hurt her as she'd hurt me, to make her feel the pain of betrayal. And I had succeeded. But now that she was gone, I was left alone with the consequences, and they didn't feel like a victory. It felt like loss. Pure, unrelenting loss. The weeks after Evelyn left stretched into months, and life settled into a strange, hollow routine. The house was quieter than ever, almost unnervingly so. I tried to fill the void with work and distractions, but nothing could shake the nagging sense of emptiness that had taken root. There were moments, fleeting, but sharp, when I'd catch myself looking at old photos or stumbling across something she'd left behind. A scarf draped over a chair, a forgotten book on a shelf. Each one felt like a ghost of the life we'd shared, a life that now felt impossibly distant. I couldn't escape the questions that haunted me. Was it worth it? Was the revenge, the public humiliation, and the destruction of her career justified? At the time, it had felt like justice, a way to reclaim the power and control she'd stolen from me. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it felt like I'd torn myself apart in the process. Evelyn wasn't the only one who had lost everything. I'd lost too. Our friends, once mutual pillars of support, had grown distant. Some had taken sides, while others had simply drifted away, unwilling to get caught in the crossfire. My reputation wasn't unscathed either. While I hadn't been the one to betray the marriage, the bitterness and vindictiveness with which I'd handled it left a mark. Even at work, I felt the change. Colleagues who used to engage in friendly banter now kept their conversations brief. I couldn't blame them. My anger had made me difficult to be around, my obsession with revenge alienating even those who had initially supported me. Evelyn, I'd heard, was living with her sister in another city. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she was trying to rebuild her life, picking up freelance work where she could and keeping to herself. I couldn't say I wished her well, but I didn't wish her further harm either. One evening, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, staring at the pile of documents and evidence that had once fueled my rage. The receipts, the messages, the timelines, they had been my weapons, my justification for what I'd done. Now, they felt like relics of a battle that had left both of us irreparably broken. I thought about the man I'd been before all this, the man who trusted easily, who believed in the strength of his marriage, who saw Evelyn as his partner in every sense of the word. That man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. If I could go back, would I have done things differently? Could I have confronted her without tearing down everything in the process? I didn't know. Maybe there was no right way to handle betrayal, no clean resolution to a broken marriage. What I did know was this: revenge doesn't heal wounds. It deepens them, turning anger into bitterness and heartbreak into regret. I finished my drink and stared at the empty glass, the weight of the past pressing down on me. There was no peace in this ending, no sense of closure or redemption. Evelyn and I had both destroyed what we'd built, and now we were left to pick up the pieces alone. In the end, there were no winners, only two people who had once loved each other, now lost in the wreckage of their choices. And that, I realized, was the true cost of betrayal.